My father refused to walk me down the aisle because his golden daughter had a launch party that day, but he called me in desperation when I found a replacement. This story will surprise you. Don't forget to subscribe. For a long time, I always knew that my parents preferred my older sister, Vicky, over me. She was the planned daughter, while I was the result of an accidental pregnancy barely 10 months later. They probably didn't even want me, but decided to keep the pregnancy anyway. My mother's parents had passed away before I was born, but my father's parents were very much alive, so they took on a significant role in my upbringing. Grandma and Grandpa were the constants in my life, providing the love and support that I often felt was lacking from my own parents. I remember so many times when my parents would leave me behind with my grandparents and only take my sister on trips. When I was young, I didn't mind because it was fun living with my grandparents, but as I grew older, when I was 6 or 7, I realized how unfair it all was. But my problem wasn't just with my parents, it was also with my sister Vicky. Although I didn't hold a grudge against Vicky, I couldn't help but feel like an unwanted addition to the family. She knew it too, and made me feel like a stranger every day in my own home. She always competed with me for everything, whether it was grades, our parents' attention, or even the smallest achievements. It felt like a constant battle for validation, and I was always on the losing side because my parents always preferred her. As a result, I felt truly inferior, and we never quite understood each other. Our relationship seemed more like a perpetual competition, with her always coming out on top. On one occasion, she wanted to be friends with a group of girls, but since she was a nerd, she was afraid to approach them. One of the girls and I had art classes together, so I introduced her to the rest of the group, and we all used to hang out together. Vicky was so jealous of this that she had my parents talk to me about including her. Moreover, whenever I was with them, she would try to fight, but my mom called me selfish, while my dad said she was my sister and I should take care of her. Reluctantly, I agreed and introduced Vicky to the rest of the girls. Now, Vicky doesn't have many friends, so she might seem too enthusiastic, and she constantly tried to impress the girls in our group, often coming off as annoying. Despite her efforts, she struggled to find her place among them, and the awkward tension between Vicky and the other girls was always palpable. For example, one of the girls was interested in a guy, so Vicky took it upon herself to approach him and let him know that the girl liked him. He laughed because he wasn't interested and went and told everyone, which embarrassed the girl. After this, the girls made it clear that they didn't want me to bring Vicky to our gatherings, so I agreed. However, Vicky didn't accept it. She threw a tantrum when she found out that the girls didn't want anything to do with her and insisted to our parents that I shouldn't spend time with these mean girls either, since she was her sister and I should defend her. I refused and told her it was her fault that they didn't want to be friends with her, but my parents, as always, supported her. They gave me a lecture about how Vicky didn't have bad intentions, that I should try to convince the girls to forgive Vicky, but if they didn't, then I should also distance myself from them. I refused and stood my ground. I enjoyed hanging out with them, and unlike Vicky, I wasn't going to jeopardize my friendship in any way. I told my parents that I had had enough and that it wasn't my responsibility to find friends for Vicky. My parents were angry and turned their backs on me for weeks, but I'm glad I stood firm. This group of girls has remained my friends to this day, and they are basically like my sisters. I have cried with them, laughed with them, and shared some of the most significant moments of my life. And that wasn't the only reason Vicky came to hate me. There was also another incident with a guy she was in love with, a guy I had no idea about and with whom I sat in some classes because we were friends. He tried to ask me to the prom, but I politely declined because I was already going with someone I liked. Later, when Vicky found out, she made a big fuss about it, telling my parents how I always took the things she wanted and how I was flirting with the guy, knowing how she had felt about him for months. She called me a bunch of nasty names that no one should say to their own sister, and told my parents how she wished I wasn't her sister. My mother took her side, telling me that what I had done was wrong, and that as a sister, I should respect the girl code. I tried to explain that I wasn't even interested in the guy and that I had declined his invitation. So, she was free to ask him if she wanted, but Vicky refused to let it go. Looking back, I think she knew the guy would have rejected her anyway, so she just wanted to take it out on me because he had invited me instead of her. Once, my dad took me out for ice cream, telling me he wanted to spend some father-daughter time with me. This had never happened before, so I was really happy. However, he started asking me a lot of questions, like if my boyfriend and I were being careful, if my boyfriend came from a good family, or if my boyfriend and I were using drugs. I was shocked by his line of questioning and asked him what he meant by all that. It was then that my dad revealed that Vicky had been making up stories, telling my parents for months that I was using drugs and drinking alcohol with my boyfriend. This was a complete lie, and I showed my dad my phone to prove that Vicky was lying. Later, when my dad confronted her about all the lies, she tried to justify it by saying that no one our age simply spends time with a guy and that I was hiding things from everyone. I was so angry that I yelled at her for trying to create an unnecessary problem and told her it wasn't my fault that she had no one to go out with, but that she needed to stop interfering in my life. Vicky didn't accept this and hit me. This came out of nowhere, as she had never been physically violent before. My nose started bleeding as I fell to the ground, clutching my face in pain. My parents rushed me to the hospital and all the while begged me not to press charges against Vicky. They said how it would ruin her life while I was sitting in the back seat holding my face. Vicky didn't even care. She didn't even apologize. Later, when the nurse asked me about the incident, I told her the truth, and she called Child Protective Services. My parents were furious with me for involving Child Protective Services, seeing it as a betrayal of family loyalty in their eyes. Vicky's actions were dismissed as a mere accident and isolated incident that didn't warrant such drastic intervention. They begged the authorities and insisted that Vicky was not a danger to me and that her actions were out of character. In the end, Vicky was released, but they warned my parents that they would be closely monitoring our situation in case other incidents occurred. As you can imagine, Vicky was really affected, as were my parents. Later, my parents told me they were disappointed in me for trying to ruin my sister's life. My mother started crying and told me how I was tearing the family apart by involving outsiders. My father's disappointment was palpable. He always had words full of reproach while questioning my decision to escalate the situation. I firmly told him that I wanted Vicky out of my life, and they agreed. I felt guilty for involving the authorities, but for the first time, I felt safe in my own home. Once Vicky had been formally warned, my parents had a separate conversation with her, and from that day on, she stopped speaking to me completely. I preferred this much more than having her constantly hovering around me or trying to insert herself into my life. When my grandparents found out about this incident, they asked me to pack my things so I could live with them for the rest of high school. They informed my parents, who didn't protest much, so I went to live with my grandparents. Unlike my parents' home, I felt safe and loved here. The remaining days of high school went well, and I made lasting memories with my friends. My parents never visited or called me during that time. I knew they were happy with their beloved daughter, so I never tried to contact them, even though it hurt that they could discard me so easily as if I were nothing. When I graduated from high school, my parents made the day about Vicky. They didn't even congratulate me or come near me, and I felt like a stranger to them. However, my grandparents were there and scolded my parents for being so obvious about their favoritism. I don't know what my grandfather said to them, but my dad later awkwardly approached me and congratulated me. Later, I found out that I had been accepted into a good university with a full scholarship. I was very happy about that because I was afraid to ask my parents for financial help. I informed my grandparents about this, and they took me out to dinner at a nice restaurant. After dinner, my grandmother posted pictures of me on her Facebook account, writing a long caption about how proud she was of me for being an outstanding student. Our relatives soon found out and joined in the congratulations. I guess some of them might have contacted my parents, who had no idea about all this, instead of feeling happy about it. My mother called me the next day to tell me that Vicky had locked herself in her room crying because she hadn't been accepted into any university and that I was deliberately trying to make my sister feel bad about her grades. By speaking with all our relatives, she told me that all this was my fault because I was apparently depressed after the Child Protective Services incident and had pushed Vicky to get bad grades. I was so incredibly devastated that my own mother could blame me for something, so that was the last time I spoke with her. My grandparents helped me move into my college dorm since my high school boyfriend's university was far from me. We had broken up, so I started university single. The breakup had been difficult, but I was excited to meet new people. This is where I met Rob, and he and I were both first-year students, and we both spent half of our days in the library. Rob was different from anyone I had ever met before. He is a quiet person and liked to study, which was similar to me, and we quickly found common ground in our shared love for university. As the weeks turned into months, our friendship blossomed into something deeper, and I realized that I had developed feelings for Rob that went beyond simple friendship. Being outgoing, I was quite direct about my feelings for Rob, and I was surprised to find out that he felt the same way. We started dating and have been together for 8 years. My grandparents have met Rob and simply adore him. I've met Rob's parents, who literally treat me like their own daughter. Occasionally, Rob's mother has even confessed to me how she always wished for a daughter, so she's happy that Rob found someone wonderful like me. To be honest, this is the first time I'm surrounded by family who appreciate me and don't hold grudges. I've told Rob stories about my childhood, and he listens and understands my relationship with Vicky. Over these past 8 years, my parents have barely contacted me, except for the occasional birthday message if they remembered, but that's it. Recently, Rob and I got engaged. He proposed while we were hiking to our usual spot to watch the sunrise, and it was a dream proposal. It was so sweet to see how nervous he was while asking me, and I had no doubts in my mind when I accepted. I posted engagement photos on my Instagram and also informed my grandparents about it. They were so happy for me and congratulated us on our future. I guess the news must have spread because my parents called me out of the blue to congratulate me as well. I thought it was just a casual conversation since we hadn't talked for years. They asked about my life, my job, my apartment, before my dad directly asked if he could walk me down the aisle. I was surprised by his sudden question, as just moments earlier, he didn't even know which company I worked for. I told him that I hadn't thought about it yet, and my dad said it would be embarrassing if I didn't invite him and that others would question us about it. So it would be better if he walked me down the aisle. I told my parents that I didn't even know if I was going to invite them to my wedding since we hadn't been in contact, but this upset them. My mother started telling me how disappointed she was with my response, emphasizing the importance of family and tradition. She continued telling me how it would always be about my parents, no matter what, and that I should put the past behind. Part of me was tempted to listen to my parents and accept my dad's offer because I wanted to repair our relationship, but another part of me hesitated, afraid to open myself up to potential disappointments and hurt again. However, I was about to start a new chapter in my life in a few months, so I told my dad that he could walk me down the aisle, and he seemed delighted. During the wedding preparations, I contacted my high school friends, with whom I had always kept in touch despite the physical distance that had grown between us due to our careers. I told them how I wanted the group to reunite and that I wanted them to be my bridesmaids. There were many tears of happiness and congratulations, and without hesitation, they accepted my invitation to be part of my bridal party, since it was an opportunity for us all to get together again. We all planned to go to Las Vegas to celebrate my bachelorette party, while Rob had a separate bachelor party with his friends as well. My friends and I posted a bunch of photos from the party, and overall, everyone had a great time. However, when I got home, my parents called me to tell me how disappointed they were that I hadn't invited Vicky to be part of the celebration. I told them that there was no way I would have included Vicky in my bachelorette party and that I didn't want her to be part of my life. This shocked my parents, and they asked me what I meant. So I clarified that Vicky's actions, particularly her history of lies and gossip, had left me deeply hurt and distrustful of her intentions. I couldn't imagine inviting her to such an intimate and joyful occasion as my bachelorette party, knowing that her presence would make my party less enjoyable. I also informed my parents that this was the reason she was not invited to my wedding as well. Upon hearing this, my parents lost their temper. They complained that I had no right to exclude my sister from my wedding and that it was my duty as her sister to include her in such important events. They told me that Vicky was excited to meet me after learning that I was getting married. I was confused and asked my parents where she got that idea, since we hadn't even spoken for a long time. But my parents ignored my concerns, saying that this was not how sisters behaved. I told them they had to understand that my relationship with Vicky was complicated. After everything that had happened, I simply didn't feel comfortable having her as part of my wedding. Not even once has she apologized to me for everything she put me through. However, my parents generally ignored my words. My mother kept saying how she wanted everything to be resolved and that I should make an effort to invite Vicky. My father insisted that our relatives would talk about why my sister wasn't invited, and this would end up affecting my wedding. However, I knew it was better not to give in to their demands, so I didn't back down. I told them it was fine if people talked behind my back and questioned my character, as long as I was surrounded by people I liked and trusted during my wedding. My mother then asked if my fiancé would be okay with this, and also tried to use the in-laws card, saying that they would judge me for being so incredibly cruel as to exclude my own sister from my wedding. I laughed and informed my parents that my fiancé and in-laws knew the dynamic of my family, and that none of them would care whether Vicky was present or not. They pressured me to reconsider, suggesting the importance of family unity and forgiveness, but I didn't budge even an inch because I wasn't willing to compromise my own well-being to placate others. In the end, we agreed to disagree, each of us holding on to our own perspectives, and my parents said they needed to think things over, and we ended our conversation there. I informed my grandparents about this because I felt a bit guilty for confronting my parents, and they supported me completely. My grandparents told me I shouldn't force myself to invite anyone I didn't want there, and that my parents, as usual, were trying to make me feel guilty. Since this conversation, I felt a bit better about my decision and have been distracted with wedding preparations, as my wedding is approaching rapidly. Last week, my dad called me to inform me that he had thought a lot and that he and mom would no longer attend the wedding. Before I could react, he continued saying that this also meant he wouldn't be walking me down the aisle. I asked if there was a specific reason, and he informed me that Vicky would be moving to a new place soon that my parents had helped her find. And since I was going to exclude her from the wedding, she had decided to hold a housewarming party that same day, so they would attend that instead of my wedding. I couldn't believe what my father was telling me, because he wasn't even invited in the first place, let alone walking me down the aisle. But he was considering telling me that he was the one who decided not to do it. However, the idea that my own sister's housewarming party took priority over my wedding was a hard blow that was a continuous line of what I had felt for years. I simply told him I understood and hung up the call. Although I tried to act brave in front of my father, deep down the pain of rejection affected me. When I told Rob, he was furious about how insensitive my parents could be after they had insisted on being invited. It was he who gave me the idea to ask my grandfather, as he and Grandma had been basically there in my life more than my parents. I agreed, so I called my grandparents and asked if they would be willing to walk me down the aisle at my wedding. I couldn't hold back while asking my grandfather. "You and Grandpa have always been there for me," I said with my voice choked with emotion. "You have been more than just grandparents to me. You have been like parents, and I can't imagine anyone else I would want by my side on my wedding day." My grandfather didn't even hesitate before saying yes. He told me how honored he would be to walk me down the aisle, and unlike my parents, he wouldn't disappoint me. His words reassured me, and at that moment I felt a deep sense of peace. With my grandparents by my side, I knew I had a family that loved me unconditionally and accepted me just as I am, with all my imperfections. I also spoke with my father-in-law about this, and Rob's parents assured me that they didn't mind if my parents didn't attend, and that, regardless of their presence, they were delighted to witness and support our union. My wedding is in 2 days, and today I woke up to several missed calls from my dad. I called him back thinking it was an emergency, and when he answered, he asked if it was true that my grandfather would walk me down the aisle. I told him yes, it was true, and then my dad got furious, saying how disrespectful it was to have asked my grandfather. I reminded him how he was the one who decided not to come to my wedding, so I didn't understand why he was so upset. My dad continued yelling at me about how he and Mom were just trying to make me see how wrong my actions were, and that they thought by declining the invitation, they would teach me a lesson. He went on about how he and Mom had raised me and paid for my food and education, so my grandfather had no right to replace him. I tried to reason with him, explaining that my grandfather had been there for me in ways that he and Mom never were, but he wouldn't listen. He also told me how I had done nothing but push everyone away and that all of this was my fault. I don't think I did anything wrong in this situation. I suppose everyone would have done the same, but how am I the bad one for asking my grandfather to walk me down the aisle and not my father? Update. Many people opined, and most said I wasn't the bad one. I've seen many pieces of advice and suggestions on how I should approach this situation. I agree that I need to cut off contact with my parents permanently because their constant indecision is exhausting and starting to affect my mental health. I don't want them in my life when they have consistently shown that Vicky is always their first priority. My parents are selfish, and I've known that for a long time. However, how can a daughter simply stop loving her parents? It's much easier said than done, but it's very difficult to actually do. However, for my peace of mind, I have no choice but to do it so I can enjoy my wedding tomorrow. Update 2. I'm sorry for the lack of update this past month, but I've been quite busy since my wedding. Yes, my wedding went quite well, with my grandfather by my side as I walked down the aisle, despite my parents' absence. I couldn't have been happier exchanging vows with Rob, committing to spend the rest of our lives together. My friends and I danced all night, and I can't begin to describe how important it is to stay in touch with your childhood friends, no matter what, because sometimes they are your chosen family. During the reception, I felt a slight pang realizing that my parents weren't there to share this special moment, especially when I saw Rob's parents and cousins giving speeches for him. However, I found comfort in knowing that I had made the right decision for myself by prioritizing my own well-being and happiness. Some of my friends gave speeches, sharing memories of our experiences and the bond that had brought us together, both in good times and bad. In the days following the wedding, Rob and I went on our honeymoon, which his parents had paid for as a wedding gift. I spent my days just lounging, enjoying time with my husband, and feeling so elated. Every time I look at Robbie, I realize he is now married to me. As mentioned before, I cut off all contact with my parents, blocking them everywhere. I didn't bother sending them an explanation because, frankly, they don't even deserve one. I have no idea if Vicky actually had a housewarming party that day, or if it was just an excuse for my parents not to attend my wedding, but at this point, I don't care. I wish them nothing but the best for them and their dear daughter. Update 3. I didn't intend to share more after my last update, but something unexpected just happened, and I think you all deserve to know. I hadn't checked my email in the past month due to my wedding and honeymoon, but today, while checking emails, I found an email from Vicky. I don't even know how she found my email address, and I was completely shocked. I hesitated about whether to open her email or just delete it without reading it. But as the saying goes, curiosity killed the cat. Inside was a lengthy message from Vicky, expressing her regret for our strained relationship and her desire to reconcile. She acknowledged the mistakes she had made in the past, admitting that she had been selfish and immature. Vicky apologized for the pain she had caused me over the years and expressed a genuine desire to make amends. She continued by saying how happy she was for me now that I'm married and that she wishes me nothing but the best. She ended the email pleading that I don't punish my parents by cutting them off and that they missed me. Reading her words, I felt a mix of emotions: surprise, skepticism. Part of me wants to believe that Vicky has really changed, that she is sincere in her apology and is willing to work on repairing our relationship. But another part of me remains doubtful because it seems too good to be true. However, regardless of what she wrote, I know for certain that my parents don't miss me, because if they did, they wouldn't have treated me this way all these years. I considered replying to her, but then decided not to. After all, forgiveness is not something to rush. It's a process that requires time and reflection. Still, I don't know if I want to have a relationship with her again. I might forgive her, but that doesn't mean we'll finally be sisters. To be honest, after my wedding, I no longer feel alone. I've learned to recognize that I have my loving husband by my side, supportive friends, and the unwavering love of my grandparents. And with their support, I know I can face any challenge that comes my way without needing Vicky or my parents in my life. I've also done some research and found a good therapist with whom I've scheduled my first appointment. I've taken this step to address and resolve any wounds from my past and heal from them. Update 4. I think I did the right thing by not responding to the email I mentioned in the last update, because now everything is coming to light. It turns out that Vicky didn't write anything, and it was my parents using her account. That's why they stress so much about me forgiving my parents, because it was them who wrote it. I know this because I happened to run into Vicky one day, and when I greeted her, she looked at me with disgust, as usual. I mentioned the email since I thought my lack of response was the issue, and she told me she hadn't sent me anything. She pulled out her phone and found the email in her sent folder, but she swore she hadn't written it. At that moment, we both realized who the author was, as some computer in the house still had Vicky's session open. I also asked her about the housewarming party, and she said it hadn't happened. So as I suspected, it was all a lie from my parents. Then we each went on our way, and that was that. Honestly, I don't know who was worse in my life, my sister or my parents, because at this point, what my parents did is already too twisted. At least now everyone will know, because I made a post on my Instagram with the links to my Reddit, so all my family and close friends are reading this story. Did you like this story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, so we can bring you more complete Reddit stories that are only posted in parts on other social networks and on Reddit itself. See you in the next story.